The topic I'm discussing today is probably one that's a little different than what I usually talk about, and that is contemporary gender theory. And I want to talk about the foundations of modern gender theory, philosophically speaking and just ideologically speaking, to know kind of where these ideas are coming from. The notions of modern gender theory are so prominent today in all sorts of places. I mean, nearly any discourse we have, whether it's through media, social media, news, religion, philosophy, anything in the academy, I mean, you're going to be encountering modern gender theory issues, and these are things that affect our lives nearly every day, and we're encountering them constantly. So as a pastor, I'm dealing with this stuff in the church and trying to give solid theological answers to these questions as people are raising these questions. And, especially as more people, younger people are graduating from colleges with more questions than ever before related to these particular topics, we really have to answer them. It's incumbent upon us to give answers to these questions. So, I wanted to delve into this issue, and I know, of course, my stance on the issue, biblically speaking, because of the text of Scripture, which I think is pretty clear on the nature of gender in a number of ways. But what I wanted to do was dive into some of the ideological foundations of contemporary gender theory and the notion that gender is just a social construct. And so the goal of this video is just to kind of give a brief explanation of what some of the philosophical shifts were that happened that led to kind of where we are today. Now, we're going back quite a bit to talk about this, so we're not going back just 10, 20 years. But really, I think the foundations start with the existentialist movement and the rise of second wave feminism, then leading into third wave feminism, which leads us to the point where we are at today. So what we have to understand is existential philosophy, kind of as our foundation. And modern gender theory really comes from two places philosophically. One is postmodernism and the other is existentialism, and different aspects of each of those movements have impacted contemporary feminist theory, contemporary gender theory as a whole. So we're going to start with existentialism. Now, existentialism is a movement that we could say begins in the 19th century. The major figures are Soren Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, who's a very, very famous name. Everybody knows Nietzsche when one way or another. The phrase God is dead, at least, even if you don't really understand what he actually meant by that, which most people don't. But nonetheless, those are kind of the two foundational figures. But existentialism then, Sartre, the French existential philosopher, the author of several plays, No Exit is probably the most popular one that's well known. If you think back to some of his ideas and his general philosophy, being in nothingness and some other ideas, to kind of give a brief summary, a very rough sketch of what existentialism is all about in this area, and that is the notion that existence precedes essence. Now, Sartre's the one who came up with that phrase, and it's been used as a way to summarize the whole movement. How fair that is or not, that's another question. But at least in Sartre, the notion that existence precedes essence is really the foundation of philosophy. And what the existentialists are doing is dealing with philosophy in terms of the human person specifically. Heidegger talks about Dasein, or a being, which is the individual person, the self. And we have this turn in philosophy from trying to study the objective world as it is out there to focusing on issues of the self, but particularly the nature of one's identity and the nature of one's essence. Now, in classical philosophy, we have this idea of an immortal soul, for example. In the Greeks and in Christianity and in other traditions as well, where there is a persistent identity that an individual has that they are created with. And that identity is preserved then over time because there's an immortal soul. There's an essence to what somebody is. And so we're defined largely by who we are and what we are and our own essence. Now, this changes with existentialism when it's taught that we create ourselves. We are self-creative. And we make some kind of a free decision to decide exactly who we are. And this then ends up throwing out the whole idea that there is some kind of subsistent self that exists or persists over time, at least in the sense that classical philosophy holds on to that idea. So we see that shift in existentialism. And so it's the idea that instead of just having being, we are creating our being. We are creating our identity. We are creating who we are through free acts of human decision. Now, the existential philosophers have different ways of understanding this, but that's the first and primary basic notion that you have to have when we're delving into the foundations of modern gender theory, is that there is an idea of the self being one who is freely created by our decisions and acts and our self-understanding, rather than accepting who we are as someone that is created with a distinct essence or an immortal soul. There's the shift. And when we have that shift, that's where modern gender constructs then come into this whole discussion. The movement really begins in terms of gender ideas with the writings of someone named Simone de Beauvoir, who is considered an existential philosopher. She was a lifetime partner of Jean-Paul Sartre, though they never married and they have kind of an open relationship. But they were connected. And so a lot of Sartre's ideas in being and nothingness definitely were influential upon de Beauvoir as well in her writings. And she was the most influential writer in what's often known as the second wave of feminism. And in particular, this book, which is called The Second Sex, it was first published in 1949. And it's huge. If you want to actually read the book, it's massive. It's almost 800 pages if you get this edition. This is the best edition. It is a newer translation, but it's the only one that actually has the complete text in English. A lot of the older translations just had sections, so if you really want the whole thing in context, it's a translation by Constance Board and Sheila Malovany Chevalier, I don't know. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. But this is the edition you want to get if you're interested in this subject and want to read a modern, good English translation of the subject. All right, so in this particular book, there's one idea that really is revolutionary that shows up here. And this is going to impact gender theory, gender ideas, which leads us to where we're at today. So this starts in the second book. We have kind of the second part of the book where she opens up by talking about kind of the life of the female. And she goes from childhood to growing up and, getting married and kind of the social expectations that women have in all these different stages of life. But in the very beginning, she starts this way. And so she's starting at the level of birth, describing what the female life is like, and she makes this statement: "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." See, there's the shift right there. So she's saying you're not born as a woman. Now, she's not saying you're not born biologically with female body parts, okay? So there obviously is a differentiation between biological body parts. Some contemporary gender theorists actually even deny that, which let's not even get into that. But she doesn't go that far with it. But what she's going to say is the expectations or the notions of what constitutes a female in society is that which is imposed upon her, not that which she is born with. So she's taking the notion of female away from this some kind of inherent thing within the individual. And she goes on to say this: "No biological, psychic, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates this intermediary product between the male and the eunuch that is called feminine. Only the mediation of another can constitute an individual as an other. Inasmuch as he exists for himself, the child would not grasp himself as sexually differentiated. For girls and boys, the body is the first radiation of subjectivity, the instrument that brings about the comprehension of the world. They apprehend the universe through their eyes and hands, not through their sexual parts. The drama of birth and weaning takes place in the same way for infants of both sexes. They have the same interests and pleasures. Sucking is the first source of their most pleasurable sensations. They then go through an anal phase in which they get their greatest satisfaction from excretory functions common to both. Their genital development is similar. They explore their bodies with the same curiosity and the same indifference." Okay, and then it goes on. But the point of this is that she's describing in detail the fact that she believes that a male and female infant basically are, in almost every way, with the exception of the sexual organs, which aren't that important to the infant anyway, they're identical. They're the same. They wouldn't even notice a difference between male and female if it wasn't societally imposed on them. Of course, you see all the Freudian kind of, anal fixation, this kind of stuff. A lot of influence from Freudian psychology and her interpretation of these things, which of course is questionable enough in itself, but leaving that aside. So de Beauvoir is coming from this perspective that society then imposes all of these ideas of what it means to be a female onto the female, one who just happens to have a different sexual organ, and that's basically it. And the argument then is what society does is it takes man as the general, right? The understood, this is what a human is man. And woman is then just defined as the other, the one who is different from the one who is the important one who defines humanity, which is the man. And so the woman is then given her own place in society that's not the man's. And all of that basically is to suppress women and to make her other and, to marginalize her and all these other things. So, but for de Beauvoir, a lot of that is done through religion, for example. She's very critical of the notion of a male god. She believes that, women are taught from childhood to obey men, and there's imposed upon her this notion of a male figure that is God who's going to punish her if she disobeys. And so that's read through this lens of these gender ideas. And so from that then is where the notion of gender being a social construct comes. Now, de Beauvoir, there's some debate whether she went quite as far as some others. But some people have argued, for example, Judith Butler in this book, Gender Trouble, which I might do another video on this because this is such an important book for contemporary gender theory and where we're at today. One of the things that she argues in that book is that basically, well, really for de Beauvoir, there's no inherent connection at all between, gender and sexual parts. So even while she might not, make the connections with, transgenderism and those kinds of things, those are a logical extrapolation from where de Beauvoir is coming from. And so that's what Butler argues. So modern gender theorists really take the basis of all of this from here. Okay, and so this notion is opposed to the classical approach to gender, which is often associated as gender essentialism, which is the title for it. Essentialism being just the broader belief of Plato, Aristotle, the ancient Greek tradition, through the medieval Christian tradition, as well as the medieval Islamic traditions, which says that things have a distinct essence. Things are defined as a thing that they are because they've been created by God. Now, there's different ways of understanding that. But the idea is that there are actual unchangeable essences. We don't just categorize things because we happen to, see things that are similar and identify them. In other words, there really is such a thing as, a male or a female in this case. It's not just that society constructs different ideas of what a female is, and then one can just become that because it's just a societal decision anyway, and they can just become that by taking on those particular roles that are associated with female. Essentialism says, no, there is something actual essential to an individual. And in this case, it's gender essentialism, which is male and female are actual essences that we actually participate in, so that I am male inherently. Right? I am not a male because males have these characteristics. One of them is a beard, so I grew a beard, so hey, now I'm male. It's that there is something inherently about me and my essence that is unchangeable, that I am in fact a male, and it's not a societal construct. So that's gender essentialism. And gender essentialism is what we find, I think, pretty clearly in Scripture. And of course, we're looking back before, Plato and Aristotle defined what essentialism is philosophically. But I think those notions are consistent with that because God does create everything according to its kind. That's the very beginning of Genesis, including the male and female kind. And that these are not societal constructs. These are things that God creates. They have an essence. There is a specific kind of thing that is that kind of thing because God created it to be a kind of thing. Which is why I think a lot of the modern gender theorists are very opposed to Christianity or religious notions altogether in some cases. And I know these things have come into the church nowadays, but it's really completely inconsistent, I think, with the entire worldview of the Christian faith, as well as just classical Western thought in general, which is clearly opposed to these things. So it's a radical departure from all of this. So, I do think there's some truth in what de Beauvoir says. I think if you actually read the book, there are places where, she's right. She's right that there's been marginalization in certain areas. And she's also right that, in society, we do have different notions of what constitutes male and female, and those things aren't inherent to our essence necessarily. So there might be things and expectations that society puts upon males and females to be certain ways, to act certain ways that aren't necessarily inherent to their essence as male or female, but they are just societally imposed. And that much is obvious. I mean, if you go to different cultures around the world, you'll know that some cultures men are supposed to do this, and some cultures they're supposed to do this, and some cultures something considered masculine where maybe somewhere else it's considered feminine. Men wear kilts, and sometimes that kind of dress might be considered feminine in other cultures because it looks like a skirt or a dress, right? So we understand that there are certain aspects of what is associated with masculinity, femininity, that are definitely society culturally imposed, and that's just inevitably going to happen. We have cultural impositions in any culture on all sorts of things. So gender is going to be no different there. So de Beauvoir is not totally wrong in what some of those expectations are. And I did another video on this topic dealing with masculinity in the church, how I think sometimes we have mistakenly identified masculinity, or what it means to be a male, with certain ideas that are part of, the 1950s ideal, for example. So we do have to be careful to try to distinguish between what is of the essence of a male or female, and then what is actually societally imposed. So we have to be careful about those things as we discuss these issues. So thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful in explaining some of this stuff. If you agree or you disagree, please leave your comments and questions on this topic. If you want me to do more videos on this subject, there's a lot more that I could say in going through kind of the history and leading up to where we are now. So this is a subject that I've been studying recently, and I'm interested in just kind of getting the background of how we got to where we are. So again, had comments or questions, make sure to post them, and please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll see you next time. God bless.